like various people's movements and stuff. Yeah. Whereas with coronavirus, there's still a lot of question marks about whether it's like fully airborne or more just like, droplet sort of airborne, like the flu. COVID-19, thank you. Yeah, that's what we're calling it now, COVID-19. So one of the things I wanted to talk about, so I wanted to do a bit of an update. Obviously, we're not going to spend like 40 minutes on it again. This is just like a quick summary, but there are a couple of things that have come up. So the first one for me actually was that essentially one of the things that got a lot of popularity, and in fact it's really popular in China, is this idea that the virus actually escaped from a lab or like is an engineered virus, or some people think it was purposely released. I've
had people at my work talking about this, yes.
Although the economic impact has been massive, so there really aren't... This is the thing with releasing a virus. There are very few countries in the world that could actually benefit from this. Mm-hmm. Because let's just say, for instance, I don't know, Russia did this. They're kind of the most likely culprit if something like this were to happen. Eventually, this will come to Russia. And when it does, Russia is screwed because their healthcare system is not going to be able to cope if it gets out. So the problem with like this idea of like people releasing biological agents is it will always come back to bite you.
Yeah.
There's a reason that we don't wage biological warfare.
And there's no like sort of there's no way of targeting an ethnic group either. It's not like you could engineer a virus to just target Chinese people or something. So releasing it is like that's another thing I've heard people talking about. It's targeted. Asian people seem to get infected more often or die more often or whatever.
Yeah,
it's not really a thing. It's not.
No. Yeah, I saw that as well. That was a rumor that like Asian people are somehow more susceptible, and it's just not true. It's just there are more cases there. Yeah. It's a lot more of a densely populated area.
Yes.
Which of course means there's going to be more spread. And I think the reason that the death rate, the case fatality rate is higher in China is just because of how overwhelmed the healthcare system is.
And also the timing of it. It happened right around Lunar New Year. Hundreds of millions of people move across China during that period. That was really bad timing for it to come out.
And also, of course, during the winter where these viruses tend to circulate more. So I actually I came across some really good analysis on why essentially this virus could not have been engineered. And it's really interesting to me as a virologist and someone who actually studies the real nitty-gritty of viruses. Mm-hmm. So obviously COVID-19 is what the disease is called, but the virus is called SARS-CoV-2. Mm-hmm. And that's what the International Virus Taxonomy Group sort of has called it. And so the interesting thing with this virus is I talked a little bit last week about the spike protein, which is that protein on the edge. And that's the protein that lets it bind to human cells and start the infection process. And this protein actually has two parts to it. So a lot of proteins, they're actually not just one big blob. Mm-hmm. They're multiple blobs kind of stuck together to actually have the
multiple
purpose work. Subunits, exactly. Mm-hmm. And the interesting thing is that the part of this virus which has enabled it to be able to infect humans is really unusual. Mm. And anyone who was trying to engineer a virus, even for legitimate reasons, I mean, we should say this, people do engineer viruses, and there's good reasons to do this because you can study a lot of things, right? You can study replication, you can study spread, and try and have information in outbreaks like this. It's really important. But this one is really unusual, and it is quite well adapted to the human protein that it binds to, which is ACE2 in this case. But this is so unlike anything that we've really seen before that if you were engineering this virus, you would never have chosen this. Like, essentially, we have a lot of sequences, like, the little parts of protein sequence that we know about already that would have been a lot better because we already know about them. And there's a lot of really convincing evidence. And I don't want to go into it too much because it really is, it's a lot more for virology nerds than it is just for, like, what the general public...
I mean, I'm here for it.
Oh, yeah. But basically, there are these things called, like, wobble bases. And it's an amazing name, essentially, for pieces of DNA that don't necessarily change exactly which amino acid is going to be in the protein, but do change, and because we talked a bit about codons last week as well, so hopefully people remember that. But yeah, essentially codons are the little 3-letter codes of DNA that make amino acids, and then amino acids make proteins. So yeah, it's essentially one of these things where if you actually really look at the virus and the evidence and everything like that, you would not have created this. It just kind of, there's a little bit of coincidence in that it kind of looks like it could have maybe been, like the splice looks kind of unusual, and it does match with some other stuff, but essentially this just could not have happened. So, I think that this is just one of those things that's going to be rife for conspiracies. Yeah. People want to blame people like this, events like this on people.
And the thing is that, like, a naturally occurring virus that's really good at infecting people is going to look like it's engineered because it's selected for. Because if it wasn't really good at infecting people, you wouldn't see it.
Exactly, especially these RNA viruses that can mutate really quickly. And I guess I should reiterate again, when I say mutate really quickly, I don't mean get worse and kill everyone. Because in the history of all of virology, that has never happened, essentially. A virus has never gotten more pathogenic.
Because then it's less likely to spread.
Exactly.
So, yes.
So that's one little tidbit. And I just wanted to talk about it because I've seen it all over everywhere. And I just think that is not true. And the other little kind of update I wanted to talk about is we're still wrestling over this question over, can this virus transmit in non-symptomatic people? And obviously that's a really important question, because if it can, containment is going to be essentially impossible. Unless we do remember the movie Contagion?
Yep.
And everyone gets basically quarantined in their house.
Moon suits everywhere.
Yeah. I am still a little skeptical, but I do want to talk about this case because it's very interesting, and I think it speaks to the way we look at evidence and how you can interpret this evidence. And the thing is that this is a quality piece of science. It was published in the New England Journal of Medicine.
Yep. Solid journal.
Yeah, really good. And essentially what happened is there is I think this woman was 20 years old, and she'd come from Hubei, specifically Wuhan, I think, which is obviously the epicenter of this outbreak. And this was on January 10th. She traveled to Anyang, which is a place that I don't think has too many cases right now, but obviously has cases. And no evidence of this person being sick, no fever, no cough, basically nothing, essentially. But by the January 17th, several of her family members actually came down with fevers, sore throat, basically the typical symptoms of coronavirus. And they eventually did test positive for coronavirus using PCR. Anyone who was around for those, the dailies, we've started doing daily videos now. So check out our YouTube channel if you're not already, Science Club Network on YouTube. It's actually a little link on the screen now too. But so we're doing those, and we talked about this new diagnostic, but these were done by PCR, which actually could be kind of important because PCR isn't necessarily replicating virus. It's genetic material, which is all over the place, trust me. I really...
Gross.
My everyday life is trying to mitigate that exact fact, which is, very annoying for me, but that's just the way it is. So, essentially they all tested positive. And at the time, this is the interesting thing, when all the family members were coming down positive, initially this subject actually came back negative for PCR. But doing contact tracing, this is the only plausible explanation that they have for why this family may have gotten the virus. They, according to the questioning, hadn't come into contact with anyone who was sick, but obviously this person coming from Wuhan is suspicious. And the conclusion of this paper is that essentially the 20-year-old, the healthy woman, she incubated the virus for 19 days unsymptomatically.
That's
scary. The problem is that is right on the extreme edge of really what could be possible for an incubation period. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that she didn't actually test positive by PCR until after every other member of her family was sick. And to me, look, this is some evidence, but again, this isn't good evidence, I don't think.
Well, the first question that comes to mind for me is like, the little graphic we're looking at has like one little data point for the PCR testing coming up negative.
Yeah.
The first thing that comes to my mind is a false negative. Like, what are the chances
Possible.
of that?
So we do know that the sensitivity of the PCR obviously isn't as good as something like, say, the antibody tests. So that could come into it. But I imagine if you've had a virus incubating for 19 days,
That it shouldn't be hard to pick up.
no, there has to be some amount of DNA in the respiratory tract, even if it's really low-level stuff. So yeah, this is interesting. It is worrying if this is true, and I think what we're probably seeing is that this is quite rare, and I think the reason for that is we're not seeing clusters in other countries of people returning from China being sort of these unsymptomatic, like typhoid Mary types, I guess, and then these little outbreaks popping up from seemingly nowhere. Yeah, so that's a good question, Madam Zelda. Like, could a family member have gotten infected by someone else? And that is essentially what I suspect may actually have happened here. That even though they don't realise they've come into contact with someone who was sick, they possibly did. And that what's actually happened is that this family cluster's occurred. And because this woman is young, being 20 years old, really good chance that she's asymptomatic. We know that this definitely affects older people a lot more. And so I think that's actually... For me, this is actually a more likely explanation, given the data that we have. I think if she'd returned a PCR positive a lot earlier on, I would have been like, okay, if it's low level, could be negative to start, over time, maybe.
There could be somebody that they forgot to mention when they were doing the interview to figure out who they've had contact with over the last few days. They might have forgot about, I don't know, the garbage man or the...
Right.
Like...
It could be anyone, right? And this is the thing, like if you are in a focal point of infection where there are a lot of people, you could come across them without ever even knowing. So, yeah, I think this is interesting, and I do think we need to take this seriously because it does provide the possibility that
if it's true, it's bad news.
Yeah,
it's real bad news.
Because we really have to think about our response if that's the case. But if it's not, then I think we just have to still implement normal controls essentially. So yeah, that's the story on coronavirus. Italy is a bit worrying. Just to quickly mention that the outbreak in Italy is starting to get a little bit out of control, and we'll see if they manage to contain that. Obviously, Italy is a modern country with a lot of healthcare facilities, but
obviously they are part of the EU, right?
Yeah, of course.
So, they've got free movement across all those borders.
Right. So that's the sort of interesting part, I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm not personally on panic stations yet. No. Again, the fact that this virus is mostly not lethal to the large majority of the population. We're not in some kind of doomsday scenario, even if it becomes pandemic and then endemic. I think the worry is the strain that it will put on the health system.
Yep.
I know for a fact that Brisbane does not have the resources to deal with this. If a large proportion of our population gets sick.
Even a few hundred people, I think, would be enough to seriously
Yeah, we've had flu seasons where we were. Actually, so that I work at a hospital, and a code blue, not code blue.
That's
the internal emergency. Anyway, internal emergency was declared because of the ability to deal with flu. The beds were running out and patients had to be transferred elsewhere. So it is a real concern. So let's move on. I think this is an interesting story. So unfortunately, I know a lot of biology people and we don't know that many chemists and physicists.
Yeah.
But you are going to do your absolute best to try and talk about this interestingly framed story where people have been able to make electricity from thin air. Which is... The funny thing is that this is either complete nonsense, or in this case, they've just used the word thin air when they sort of mean it, but it's not really.
Yeah. So essentially some scientists at the University of Massachusetts
Yes.
Amherst, that's a fun phrase, have come up with a way of generating electricity using protein nanowires.
Yes.
So basically, if they have a thin film on an electrode, and the thin film is made of these protein nanowires, and then they stick another electrode on top.
Yeah.
And then moisture from the air sort of hydrates the proteins, I guess you could say, and results in a voltage, which is pretty cool. There's not a great deal of detail in the article about how it actually works, but I mean, my guess is that proteins have areas of positive and negative charge on them due to the chemistry of the protein, and so that creates differences in charge, which can result in a voltage gradient, and that's how you get the flow of electricity.
So I love that the bacteria is called Geobacter.
Yeah.
It kind of sounds like a Pokemon.
Yeah. I choose you. No. So the cool thing about this is that the same team has engineered E. coli to produce these wires, and because E. coli is a well understood organism that's in lots of labs all around the world, theoretically you could grow this stuff anywhere. You could coat any surface with it. One of the things they suggest is like house paint.
Which is kind of interesting. The idea that, because I guess the bacteria don't have to be alive. Once these protein wires are produced, they can that energy. Well, the wires can just hang out on whatever surface. Yeah,
I mean, obviously you'd want something with lots of surface area, because the more surface area, the more voltage you're getting. Something I just thought of just then is how would you protect the protein from being munched up by...
Right, literally everything. Yeah. I mean, that's the problem with protein, anything, is that it's a food source for every living thing on this planet. And they have to be exposed, right? You can't. This doesn't work if it's not exposed to the air.
So that's an interesting technological problem. They do say that they've got prototypes that are currently powering small electrical devices.
Which is interesting. I mean, that because it's funny, right? You don't think about it, but your phone actually requires a lot of energy, and it's actually battery technology is pretty good these days that you can even do that. But being able to do this at all, obviously, look, this is cool, and the researchers themselves that have called it the most amazing and exciting application of protein nanowires yet, which may actually be true, honestly.
Because there are no other applications of protein nanowires.
I mean, this kind of stuff is very early on in its sort of development cycle, I guess. I mean, they're saying it could generate power even in areas like with low humidity, such as the Sahara Desert. So obviously this works with some interaction between like water vapor, the free electrons that are in there, and obviously what proteins are really good at actually is transporting electrons along a chain. It's how nerves work, and it's even just how life works. Respiration has that kind of process as well.
I mean, respiration is just the transport of electrons from... I mean, obviously there's going to be a trade-off between... There'll be a sort of that growth curve as the moisture increases up to a certain point where it'll level out because it's saturated and that's it. They can't produce anymore. But it's kind of interesting. I thought it was kind of cool.
I really liked this story too. Like this kind of it's funny because I like to talk about this stuff because it's interesting and it kind of shows you what science can achieve. But at the same time, it is a nice conversation. I mean, back in the Scientism days, we were actually luckily podcasting just long enough that some of the stories we talked about in the first couple of months, like the period of time where the researchers were like, in just 3 years' time, this will be ready. 3 years' time, we weren't talking about the rollout of this technology. We were talking about how they'd made these small incremental improvements. But, the thing is that these things just take a lot more time. And with a lot of money and focus, you can get a lot done. I mean, the biggest roadblock in my work is actually how much time I have. The things that I need to do my research.
If there were 4 of you, you'd get so much more done.
Right. That is the limiting factor. The most expensive part of my project is me. Honestly, I mean, all of the equipment, the reagents, everything, that's all chump change compared to the fact that I need to eat.
And sleep.
Yeah. And that essentially my employer needs to make sure I can do that.
Yeah. You don't die on the job from being overworked. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's kind of one of those things where people power really is the limiting factor. I'm kind of keen to see if this comes to anything. I mean, people always talk about like large scale systems and, where they can be incorporated. But a lot of the time, these things just, don't really pan out.
Or if it does pan out, it pans out in a very limited range of circumstances, like very specific applications where,
But the idea of like electrically conductive protein nanowires is really cool. And obviously, it's a renewable resource. You can put yeast powder in, get wires out, which I think is really nice.
You could just grow the film on whatever you want to.
Yeah,
coat it.
Because the thing is with like carbon nanotubes is they're actually incredibly difficult to produce, whereas bacteria have millions of years of
evolution to
just to kind of perfect this process. So I actually think it's really cool, it's just an interesting story that I think it was cool to talk about. And also I'm just trying not to make sure all the stories are about viruses and biology, because
that was a problem we used to have.
We had 3 biologists on the old podcast, and it was just, we all loved biology stories, but because we just knew what we were talking about. Obviously we had Ben in the very first episode, and he'll be back as well to talk some astronomy. I will say this actually, while we're at this point, if you are in Brisbane and you are wanting to get into science communication, but especially if you're a physics person or chemist, just give us a tweet at Science Club Show and let me know you're interested, because I'm happy to have anyone in studio. I really want this to be a community effort. So please come along, and you can sit where Dan is, and we can do a show.
I actually know what you're talking about.
But I think that's pretty cool, and that's kind of all we need to know. And speaking of talking about viruses constantly, let's talk about viruses a bit more.
Okay.
But this one is a bit different, actually. So luckily, we're not talking about infections or... this is actually good news. So this story is really interesting, and I've actually been following this for a long time. And this is another actually interesting one where we did talk about this towards the end of our Scientism run in a different way. So do you remember that story we did where... And this was actually Brisbane research. So at QIMR in Brisbane, they have a facility there which is like really clean, so they can do all this weird stuff. And what they were doing is they were actually growing these Epstein-Barr viruses. And it turns out that Epstein-Barr viruses have this increased tropism, which basically means preference for cancer cells, specifically glioblastoma cancer cells. And so by kind of like taking human cells out of the body and training them to fight Epstein-Barr virus, and then putting those immune cells back into the patient, because the patient cells, the cancer cells would present a lot more Epstein-Barr virus proteins on the outside. I guess we're skipping a few steps for people who don't know immunology here, actually. All right, so let's go back a little bit then, actually, because having said that out loud, I realised how much immunology is in there.
Where did the Epstein-Barr virus antigens come from?
So, all right, when cells get infected with a virus, one of the defences that almost every single cell in the human body has is to digest the virus and then essentially transport little pieces of it onto the surface of the cell. And then these immune cells come along, T cells, that recognize that protein and go, that's not right. And then essentially suicide that cell. It starts a process called, oh my God, it's not coming to me.
Apoptosis?
Yes! Right. Apoptosis. It starts a process called apoptosis, and the cell basically eats itself to make sure that the virus can't use its machinery anymore.
And to stop the spread.
Of course. Now, with Epstein-Barr virus, it turns out a good 90% of the human population just has this naturally. And for most people, it's fine. We live with it. It doesn't really do anything. It can cause like mouth sores and things like that. But really, we all have it, and it's normally fine. The problem comes often when if you're having a large infection like when you're pregnant, but often pregnant women transfer it to the babies, and it's normally okay. The other one is when you're immune compromised, which obviously a lot of things become issues then that aren't normally. So that's kind of the backdrop of that research, is that we all have this. So it's a really nice thing to use. So what they did in that original research at KIMR is they trained immune cells to specifically look for Epstein-Barr virus, because what they knew is that Epstein-Barr virus would infect cancer cells a lot more often than any other cell. So in a lot of ways, this became a targeted treatment, because the T cells would preferentially recognize these infected cancer cells and then destroy them. And they had some really good results. They had some people who, I think the mean like 5-year survival rate of glioblastoma
is not good.
Is less than 20%.
Yeah, it's like one of the worst cancers you can get.
And they managed in their cohort to increase this to 65% or something near. So that's really good.
Yeah. This is great because like immunotherapy for cancer has been like one of these things that's been talked about for, I don't know, 15 years or something.
A long time, yeah.
It's been sort of a dream because it's so, you can make it so specific, you can make it patient specific, you can...
Exactly.
It's, one of the big problems with a lot of the current cancer treatments is because they're not very specific to cancer cells, that's what causes a lot of your side effects. So like with radiation therapy, the reason why you get so sick and you lose your hair is because those cells, your hair follicles are being targeted at the same time as the cancer cells, because of the fact that they replicate a lot more than other cells in your body, and so those cells get knocked out at the same time, and that's whereas with the immunotherapy, if you could target just the cancer cells,
exactly,
more than likely you wouldn't get all those side effects.
So this is kind of a variation on that. So the interesting thing here is that what this uses is actually what's called a chimeric virus, which essentially means, obviously, the Greek chimera was... But I forget exactly. It's a mix of...
I think it's a lion and a scorpion and I think it's that one.
Yeah. If you're into Greek mythology, let us know. But yes, so it's anyway, a chimera it's a mix. It's a mix of things. And in this case... DNA
from different... organisms within the one organism, basically. But so, obviously, a virus is not technically an organism. I don't know.
No, it's an infectious particle.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yes.
You get the point.
I could talk a long time about whether viruses are alive or not. I shan't, but I can. So here's the thing with this, is that they used a virus called vesicular stomatitis virus, I believe is the name.
That's a sexy name.
Yeah. And the thing is that this virus is actually used a lot in things like vaccines, because it has a really immunogenic sort of backbone, but isn't especially dangerous. But they'll often conjugate things to it, like yellow fever or even measles. Like a lot of vaccines are actually conjugated to this.
So in other words, it triggers a large immune response.
So it makes it really good for that. But essentially what they did in this case is that they actually used the protein that Ebola uses to enter the cell, and sort of engineered VSV to use that essentially. And the reason for that is that it sort of affects the immune system. So one of the interesting things is that they're leveraging this fact that a lot of tumours, they turn off their defence against innate immunity. So I guess this is another little immunology moment. There are two types of immunity, right? There's the adaptive response, which is the one where you get infected with something and the body produces antibodies and all of those immune cells. The innate immune response is that kind of thing I was talking about before, where the cell can actually eat the virus and display it. And there's a whole lot of things called like toll-like receptors. And essentially they were discovered, I believe, in fruit flies, which is why...
You're giving me PTSD, just so you know.
So anyway, these proteins, they all recognize foreign things, basically, and then trigger a whole bunch of defense mechanisms. But tumor cells, one of the ways that they get to just replicate indiscriminately is by turning all of these off. And so essentially what they can do is, because they know that can happen, they have basically used this protein because it can exploit the fact that the innate immune system isn't working very well, and essentially make it a lot more toxic to these cells that can't deal with it. So obviously you can't just give people Ebola, but VSV isn't much of an issue, unless of course you have a whole bunch of cells that can't deal with even what in this case is actually a pretty mild virus. So I actually love this kind of stuff, right? It's really interesting how we're now leveraging like infectious agents as therapies, because before pretty much all research was about how you kill things like this. You know, which you know, it's obviously it makes sense. That's the priority. Smallpox has killed a lot of people through history. Cholera, measles, you know, and so you do want this. You do want to sort of obviously get on top of that. But now that we sort of have a lot of things like this under control, is that we can actually sort of leverage it for these treatments. So I think it's really cool that like you could use something like this. Obviously, it's good to kill the brain cells.
The bad ones.
The bad ones, the cancer ones specifically. Because...
like one of the big problems with glioblastoma is that it's often inoperable because of where it's situated in the brain. You can't get in there and cut it out.
Right.
So,
and even if you do, it's actually quite resilient to surgery. But what if you could do the surgery and then sort
knock out the remnants?
Yeah, because obviously at that point there'll be far fewer cells left, and you can target it with something like this, and maybe you could increase the survivability of people. Which I think would be great. So I'm just really glad that this technology is still coming along. And the nice thing is that clinical trials really have been done on these kinds of things, and the results are good. So
that's good.
I think we are going to see this come out as a treatment. I mean, interestingly, one of the ones that they were doing with this was literally just mega dosing of measles.
Okay.
Just mega dosing people with it. That one wasn't as successful as you might imagine.
What's next? Mumps?
So that one was kind of interesting. But yes. So we do have a comment actually from Madame Zelda who talked about Beyond 2000.
Oh, I remember that show.
Yeah.
Wow.
So we had.
I think they had to stop at the turn of the millennium because.
Right.
Yeah.
And there was a similar show called Something Millennium.
Quantum,
right?
wasn't it?
There was Quantum, and there was like New Millennium. I think that might have been there was like an English one that was like Something Millennium. And all these shows were kind of similar. They were all kind of like prognosticating into the future, basically. And yeah, it is interesting watching those shows and kind of going back to like what they thought we'd be doing now. And how in some ways we've completely smashed some of it, like the internet and like a lot of technology is just nowhere near what people predicted. And in other ways,
we're still trying to get people to vaccinate. Like,
you know, it's really bad. So yeah, it's really interesting to go back and kind of look through it in that kind of lens. So I do recommend actually going and watching those kind of shows. I really wish, you know, like ABC used to have some really nice science programming, and basically every year that the Liberal government is in power, that programming gets less and less, unfortunately.
There was a show when I was little that I used to watch a lot called Curiosity. And the two guys that ran it have, like in the last 2 or 3 years, started uploading clips from the show onto YouTube. So there's now like a couple of hundred clips. Like the show was a series of sort of 5-minute segments of, you know, here's a cool thing. That stuff's not around anymore, but.
And it was so good. Like I really miss the programming where a reporter would just go into a lab and just be like, hey,
just surprise us.
You know, just talk, and they would sort of talk about the technology. Because I think it makes for good television personally. I mean, look, you know, if I could somehow make this my living, you know, if I could somehow,
that'd be cool.
I would do that. That's what I would do. You know, I think we would set up productions and just give that content to people, because I think it's really important, because people are so divorced from the actual process of science. And I think we need more people to kind of understand how science works and not just the output.
And especially people that actually do it. Like, I think part of the problem is that a lot of people get their science education from like reading a Guardian article or something.
And to be fair to them, a lot of them are pretty well done. You know, obviously the Courier and those kind of like more tabloid type papers tend to. I don't want to say a bad job, because that's really unfair to like
They just
to the one editor who has to write 10 stories.
They don't have the expertise. They don't have the funding.
The depth isn't there, and obviously the sort of the caution around. Like we're talking about this cautiously, this story, because we know that it's cool and it could work out,
but it may not.
But it might not. Whereas you tend to see a lot of the popular, more general press talk about things as if it's the definitive, guaranteed thing that is just going to work and be amazing.
Yeah.
So, I think that's where I would love for more people like us to get the chance to just full-time do this kind of stuff. I have so many ideas, and even if it wasn't me, I would love someone to get the chance to do it so that content existed. Like we have actually a lot of people. Lee Constable is from Brisbane, and she was hosting a science show on Channel 10 of all places, Scope TV, a science show for kids.
I remember that one.
And that's a great initiative, but that I know for a fact that they have a very low budget, and they do the best they can, but basically that team is like a cameraman,
the hosts.
Lee, back in the day, who also, I think, was an editor. Whereas most well-produced shows, they have teams of producers, editors, camera people, audio people, and I just wish science got more of that. Because you look at things like, like Brian Cox's output, David Attenborough, people have a thirst for this stuff. It just, I think the problem is that a lot of that time, nature and astronomy, they lend themselves really well to TV, right?
Got great visuals, compelling stories. And one of the best things I've ever seen, it's this weird French TV show from the 70s, right? It's a cartoon. Okay.
And it's basically about how your body works. Okay. So obviously this was translated to English voiceover, but essentially all of the body's things are characters. Okay. So like the red blood cells are characters, the white blood cells are characters, a lot like the brain, like the brain is like a character, there's like the heart, like
just like real life.
Right. But it was amazing because actually it was quite scientifically in depth for a kid's show. But it was interesting because to me that made biology compelling because visually you had this thing. The same studio did a show on space. Amazing. See, that's what I love, right? And I think that made biology quite interesting. And they had a really heavy episode where they literally showed what happens when you get leukemia, you get treated, and what happens afterwards. So they had the thing where the immune cells started getting basically turned into the bad guys and started attacking other things in the body. And then the treatment comes along and kind of wipes out everything. And then afterwards, you have this scene where the good white cells, once upon a time live, yes, that is it. That is what it's called. Thank you so much. I love having a comment section. Yeah, I love doing this so much.
You're the real MVP.
Yeah, you really are. Absolutely amazing series. And I actually, you can source it if you like. I'll leave it at that, but it is possible to find.
From a legitimate online source?
An online source. And I really recommend that it's really good. But I think what I'm trying to say is that we've actually evolved to a point now where computer-generated graphics are so good. I think we could tell really compelling stories about biology now using computer generation of what's happening in the body.
Yeah. Well, some of the animations that started coming out in the mid-2000s for have you seen that one of the ribosomes walking along there?
Yes, amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, so I wonder if I can find something. I'll see if I can stick something on the screen while we're talking about this. But there are some amazing animations. There's a DNA polymerase one where basically it shows you all the DNA getting fed into the thing.
It might be that one.
Yeah. This one's in color too, which is pretty awesome.
So I wish somebody would my favorite enzyme, and yes, I have a favorite enzyme.
Topoisomerase.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I just hit the mic too.
That's fine.
Go me.
So let me see if I can find this. Yeah. So we have this crazy animation. I'll see if I can make us a little smaller.
And the thing is, it's slowed way down too.
No, it isn't there. Okay. Well, let's go back. So obviously this is really a lot slower. I'll just manipulate this a little bit so we can sort of
get my fat
see it the best. But essentially, this is what it looks like. Yeah, I'll kind of do that too. This is what it looks like when DNA is replicated, right? So you can see. Oh, my head is just so badly in the way.
Yep, you're making it worse.
Let's see if I can make this work. I'm sure I can get it to. Oh, I think I closed it. Okay. Anyway, my point is
Next week.
That's really cool, right?
Yeah.
That's really cool. And it kind of shows you the complications of biology, but also biology is just really interesting. Like, you know, you think like space is cool because it's infinite and it's big.
Yeah.
Look, don't get me wrong, pictures of nebulas and stuff and like supernovas,
Real pretty.
they're awesome.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a Science Daily coming up about new pictures about the Mars surface where there's some exposed bedrock.
Oh, I think I saw something about that.
Again, stunning. But, you know, so is biology. You know, like when you think about the exact mechanics of, you know, infection, immunity, even just bacteria living.
DNA replication is just mind-bogglingly.
Yeah. And I would love to see like a Brian Cox / like David Attenborough style series, but it's biology. I actually think it would go down really well. I think people would enjoy it. I don't think any producer has had the imagination to just give it a go.
Yeah. Because even something like how a GPCR works.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the most mundane thing in like cell biology, but it's like crazy that Anyway,
Yeah.
I'll stop nerding out now.
Yeah, but essentially, it's for me. I would love to see that kind of programming come in. So I guess this is a good time to say that we have a YouTube channel.
Yep.
It's
well done.
Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't just give you a URL anymore. So it used to be that any YouTube channel could get the sort of YouTube / something useful, not a bunch of letters. And unfortunately, we don't have one yet. But if you just search Science Club Network on YouTube, you'll find us. So obviously, before the show, we actually previewed some of the daily segments that we're doing. And what I want to do is make YouTube also a slightly separate entity from this stream. Obviously, the stream replays are uploaded there for people who missed out. But also, I want there to be some content just for YouTube. And essentially, my thing is that every day, we'll do one science story. So like kind of like a single segment from this show. And that will go up on YouTube. And we also have an Instagram, which I believe is Science Club _show. Because something went wrong when I tried to register Science Club Show. Literally, I registered that name and it instantly told me I'd violated the terms of service.
Oh, well done.
Yeah, so that was fun. But yeah, I'll be uploading pictures of my day-to-day life as a scientist. And basically all of the contributors will get access to that account.
Cool.
To like, you know, give you some like day in the life of science type things. Yeah. So that's really cool. And also, we have Twitter, of course. Please follow us on Twitter. Obviously, it's at Science Club Show. And Facebook, Science Club Network on Facebook as well. There's all, like, a lot of stuff will get shared on there so that you can...
I'm going to go and like the Facebook on stream.
Yeah. So it's really good. Like, we have a lot of ways to interact and put some daily content and share science stuff. And we just want to be really interactive. And obviously, we want ways to interface with you as the audience. Like, we want to take your questions, comments, because I would love to have a section every week where we answer 2 or 3 science questions that viewers submit. Because honestly, I want to do the content that you guys are into. So for me, that's quite important.
Liked.
There you go. That's one already. But yeah, check out the YouTube though. You're definitely missing out on a lot of content. We only have 2 daily videos because I literally started the initiative on Monday, but we will be doing that. And so I really suggest that you do that. So one of the things we want to talk about is science questions. So I actually have one. So Maynard from Twitter, and this is Maynard who is of the Triple J fame from back in the day. He's really into science and stuff. So he's on Twitter a lot. And so Maynard asked this question, and I actually thought it was a good one because my absolute favourite thing in science is melding popular culture with science. And so the question was, why were the aliens mining the Earth's molten core in Independence Day 2? Surely another planet in our solar system would have a molten core without all the fighting with human fuss. Also, if you can build a spaceship 3,000 kilometres across, just mine the sun. Which fair.
Yeah.
So this actually is an interesting question, though, because it does give us an opportunity to talk a little bit about the solar system. So the actual TLDR super easy part of this is to actually say there is another planet in our solar system which has a molten iron core, and that's Venus.
Small problem with Venus being that its atmosphere is like not good.
Venus is a case study in what will happen if we don't tackle climate change. Because basically the same thing that is happening on Earth, albeit slowly, is happening on Venus. So Venus used to look a lot like Earth until the runaway greenhouse effect essentially turned it into a horrific wasteland.
Yep.
The funny thing is that you could set foot on the surface of Venus. It is a solid planet. The problem is that the temperature is in the hundreds of Kelvin.
It melts lead, I believe.
Yeah, lead is not a solid on that planet. And also, interestingly, it rains sulfuric acid.
Yeah,
so that's nice.
Not great.
Yeah, so the gear you would need, I mean, we've landed a probe on Venus and it lasted about 10 minutes or something, or an hour or two.
So no metal equipment, pretty much.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's any, like steel, obviously.
Yeah.
Not a thing that you can do.
Carbon type nanofiber might, like, carbon fiber type stuff might work. Even like a lot of plastics would just completely melt. So the answer is yes, there actually is another planet, and Venus does have basically an identical molten core to Earth. Now there's another planet which is interesting and I think is worth talking about, and that's Mars. Because Mars did have a molten core, but unfortunately Mars is actually just slightly too small.
Okay.
And what that meant is that over time, the reason that the Earth's core is still molten is that and actually, if anyone in the audience knows more about this than me, please jump in. But essentially, the mix of like the gravitation we have, the magnetic force, allows our core to keep churning, basically. So it's constantly churning, convecting.
Currents. Yep.
But what happened on Mars is that those forces weren't strong enough to keep the core basically in a constant state of churn. And over time, it just slowly cooled until it became a solid.
Yep.
And that actually has a lot of knock-on effects for Mars. So Mars would be a very habitable planet if it weren't for the fact that its core didn't have that constant rotation. So people actually think that the magnetic field of Earth is caused by the iron, and that's true. But it's actually not just the iron. If the iron isn't spinning, we don't have that magnetic core. And that's really important because what the magnetic field of Earth does is it deflects solar energy away from the surface. So what happens on Mars is that Mars has an atmosphere, but it's always being blasted away by the sun, whereas our atmosphere is protected, a little bit by gravity as well. Yeah. We have just enough more gravity that it keeps the atmosphere sort of sucked in.
Mainly it deflects the solar wind.
But yeah, mostly it's the magnetic thing. So Venus also has that, which is why they have a thick atmosphere, because they wouldn't have had the runaway greenhouse effect either. They have the same kind of feel to us. Yeah. So yes, they could have gone to Venus. Now, interestingly, if it was iron specifically they were after, the sun wouldn't actually be a great place for that. Because essentially, the way that stars work is that obviously you start off with a lot of hydrogen, and for various reasons, that coalesces until it becomes dense enough that fusion occurs. Yep. And when fusion leads to the formation of helium, helium becomes lithium, etc., etc.
Yeah, now, boron, beryllium, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, fluorine, neon.
Right.
Yeah, so on and so forth.
Now, the bigger the star, the more heavy elements that you can make. So, for instance, gold does not come from our solar system. And I absolutely love this fact. Gold is the result of massive stars exploding and flinging material everywhere. Yeah. And in that explosion, gold is formed, right? Because at that exact moment, fusion occurs in a massive scale.
It's a stellar goldgasm.
Essentially, yeah, just poof. And but our star isn't big enough. Our star is kind of medium in size, I want to say. We're kind of like Goldilocks. Really.
Ordinary. It's an ordinary.
It's a very ordinary star. In fact, the most common, I believe, are the red dwarfs. But if you were to sort of take the median star size, ours is it. But ours can easily get up to about oxygen, but really after that, our sun doesn't quite have the mass, basically the gravitational density to produce gold or iron. So iron is produced in bigger stars, but not quite ours. So the interesting thing is, though, and this is a good point, they did build a spaceship 3,000 kilometers across.
Yep, that's a lot of material.
They could have gone to literally anywhere in the galaxy.
Yeah.
Presumably one of the places that isn't actually inhabited, in order to mine iron ore that's molten.
Yep.
Because lots of those planets exist. They have to, right? I mean, there are so many planets. There have to be plenty with a molten iron core that they could have gone to, probably closer to home than going to Earth. But that wouldn't make a very interesting film.
No.
So.
And, who is Will Smith going to punch if...
Well, that's the thing. Will Smith wasn't in the second one.
Yeah, good.
Probably one of the reasons I didn't watch it. But, but yes, that is the reason, essentially. So, yeah. I love this question. If people have pop culture science questions, please send them. I would answer questions like this for an entire show if I could.
I'm trying to think of one now.
Yeah.
I'll tweet you later.
But send tweet. Or Facebook, of course, whatever. We are available on many platforms. And I guess that brings us to the last story, which is, it's a little sad, but also, in a lot of ways, it's a celebration as well. And I did want to talk about the fact, and I want to try and get this up if I can on the screen, because NASA put together a really cool page. So I'm going to try and get that up. But essentially what I'm talking about is that mathematician Kathering Johnson passed away this week, and she was 101 years old, which is amazing.
A good run.
And her contribution to science can't be understated. She is a very smart person. I mean, So to give it some context, essentially, Kathering Johnson belonged to a group of mostly women, I think almost exclusively women, who were essentially human computers. They were called computers at the time.
That was their job.
They were sort of referred to as computers. And the interesting thing is that, especially Kathering Johnson in this group, so obviously there's a lot of other women who were in that group, and I really recommend you watch the film Hidden Figures for a really nice sort of take on that era of time. But Kathering Johnson especially, she was born and raised in a period of time where someone like her didn't have much chance to succeed, but she did. And I think that's what makes her story all the more impressive. So she's an African-American woman in America in the 40s and 50s who, because of a lot of dedication on her behalf and her family's behalf, managed to become one of the most important mathematicians of our entire lifetime. Which sounds like an overstatement, but it's really not, because what Kathering Johnson was responsible for, which I haven't said yet, is essentially calculating the trajectory of objects that were launched from this planet.
Can we think of any important objects that have been launched from our planet?
Essentially, I've kind of prepared a bit of a biography here, but so she was born in White Sulphur Springs. And WVA, I think, is West Virginia. Yes. And the interesting thing is there, right, at that time, schooling, African Americans didn't attend school after 8th grade. So, history sucks. And her dad was a farmer, right? So not anyone of any extravagance or resources.
Great education that could inspire her to.
He recognised that he wanted his family to be educated. He wanted his children to be educated, and he drove 120 miles, which is about 200 kilometres roughly.
What's 1.6 times 120? Yeah,
it's about 2 kilometres, right? 200 kilometres, which is massive. And basically managed to get his kids to the West Virginia State School. So. The interesting thing is that Kathering Johnson actually skipped a bunch of grades to graduate from high school at the age of 14 and graduated from college at 18, which puts my entire career to shame, honestly.
Yep. Pack up and go home.
Right? Immensely impressive person. And essentially, she was really good at mathematics and drew the attention of a young professor, Schieffelin Clayton. And basically, they were encouraged to to get involved with a bunch of things, and eventually found her way into this pool of mathematicians who were kind of like prospects, I guess. And basically within 2 weeks, it was pretty obvious she was smart. And she joined a bunch of engineers who, and I love this, 5 years later became involved in Space Task Force, which later would become the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. And of course,
I think we can see where this is going.
now the National Aeronautics and Space Association, NASA. So essentially at this time, obviously we weren't necessarily launching a lot of humans back then, but this was in 1958. But they were launching a lot of satellites and things, and things that would land on the moon. And Kathering Johnson was essentially responsible for these in her brain. I just want to...
With pen and paper.
Yep, with a piece of pen and paper and her brain to figure out the mathematics. So using Newton's laws, Kepler's laws, those kind of things. Now, eventually, of course, computers were invented, but mathematicians were very important back then as well. So what a lot of people also don't realize is that a lot of programmers were women as well. So this like stupid like man-bro idea now that women can't code is just absolute nonsense. Women have been coding since coding existed. And so basically between computing...
I mean, what's her name? Damn it.
Yeah, I know.
Lovelace?
Yeah, Lovelace.
Yes.
Lovelace, yeah.
Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So, computation has been around for a long time, and women have been at the forefront of that for a long time. Shut up, man babies, essentially. But yeah, so the interesting thing is that even once they started using computers, the technology was new, and they didn't trust the computers.
Yeah, well,
of course, right?
Have you seen those things?
Right. I mean, they were bigger than the size of the studio.
Yeah.
Which obviously isn't a massive room, but that's a lot compared to this thing. Which definitely has way more computing power than any of those computers did. By probably orders of thousands or millions, probably.
Millions.
Even trillions, right? We're into the tera petaflop era now. Really not as advanced. But they didn't trust them, so they still needed people like Katherine to check the math and to make sure that people like Glenn Johnson and the people who landed on the moon didn't die. Which
they could get back.
And could get home, and it was a big deal. So, I really think it's important to celebrate people like this, because these were the people who weren't the flashiest, right? They weren't super famous.
It's the nitty gritty, the people that had to do the hard work. They didn't. There's nothing flashy going on here. She's just doing a bunch of calculations. That accidentally have a bunch of importance.
And she worked at NASA for 33 years as a mathematician, and still. To the day that she was still basically to the day she died, tutored people in math. She was passionate about mathematics and really advanced the cause of that. And I just think that this is the hidden part of science that, and unfortunately, it happens to women a lot. It wouldn't take us a lot to think of Jocelyn Bell, Rosalind Franklin. A lot of people who just, because of the time and era that it was, their contributions just really got minimized compared to the men who ended up being the sort of rock stars. And the thing is as well, scientists were rock stars back then as well. So I really wanted to just talk about an amazing person who has contributed to science in a massive way, under the radar, and really deserves the recognition that films like Hidden Figures, amazing. And I'm so glad that we're starting to get this kind of content. Because obviously, look, it's great for the visibility of women, and I really hope that there are young girls who see that and want to go into science. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who are not necessarily the younger audience, but the older people in the audience would definitely know that if you were interested in science as a girl, teachers would tell you that science isn't for girls back then. So I think it's great that these days, and there's a really nice piece of research where 10 years ago, if you asked young girls to draw a scientist, only 5% would draw a woman. And these are all kids, but women is where this is especially, young girls is where this is especially depressing. Now it's 49%. Basically, young girls, if you basically ask them to imagine a scientist, They just imagine themselves, but if they're a scientist.
Yeah.
Which for me is great.
Yeah.
50% is obviously still a little low, but for me that's amazing. That's still a lot of progress. So yeah, I'm really glad that we can get these stories out there, and definitely like read the NASA site. I occasionally demonstrate science at a museum. We still have some kids who think girls can't be scientists, and that to me just really sucks. So you've done some undergraduate teaching. I've done some undergraduate teaching. The interesting thing is that at least 50% of the undergraduates coming in now are women. Yep. Probably more, because in some fields. Yeah,
it depends what subject.
We should qualify this. We were teaching medical science, and the sort of medical science pathology lab field is quite woman dominated.
Yep.
Obviously, at engineering, IT, women are still quite underrepresented.
Yeah,
and unfortunately, knowing the culture of those degrees, I can really understand why as well. And that is a social change that has to come about from a younger age, so that there aren't men who just sort of, I don't know, feel entitled for some reason.
Well, I know once I hit postgrad, like, I don't know the exact figures, but roughly 50% of the people I worked with were female. So
and luckily as well, I mean, there's Australia has this great foundation called the Athena Swan Foundation, which is actually not so much about getting women into science, but like the career trajectories that women have after that. Because if you look at the figures, a lot of women come into science, but then the graph kind of crosses when it comes to senior positions, where men tend to still end up being professors and sort of those tenure positions. So there's a lot of reasons for that, misogyny being one, but obviously the way that science treats women who have children, for instance. Like even changing your name, getting married can be a really big issue for women in science
because you've got publications.
So a lot of women just obviously keep publishing under their maiden name, which is just unfortunately sensible. So there's a long way to go, but we are kind of getting there, which is nice. So, and to that vein, two weeks in a row, the show has been all men. If you're, to be fair, I actually did have a female scientist lined up, but that was a calendar clash in the end, and we couldn't get it. But I'm really keen to have a diverse panel, and I mean that in multiple ways. Men, women, people from different ethnic backgrounds. Because the thing is well, I think the public perception of science is that it's just all dudes. But I have lunch with people from...
Like that mad scientist trope.
Just like basically people that look like us. We can say it, right?
But older.
but older, yeah. But I know for a fact that science isn't actually like that. I have lunch on a table with people from 6 different countries. Pretty even spread of men and women. Different ethnic backgrounds. Science is really diverse because... being able to do science, obviously there are some cultural things, but, I think one of the things that really annoyed me about when I talked about the coronavirus story, what I didn't talk about is the origin of that, which was this completely derogatory racist post about how, because it was China and their scientists surely must be less competent. You have not seen these people come over to this country and work in the lab. I'm sorry, but scientists, I've never met a scientist from anywhere in the world that didn't come to Australia and be amazing. Because science actually weeds out people fairly quickly who aren't competent.
You think we have problems with places for education in Australia? Can you imagine what it's like in a place like China or Japan or Korea?
It's ridiculous.
The competition, if you get to the point where you can make it out of that country as a scientist, you're amazing. So leave your racism at home, please, or jettison it into the sun, more preferably, forever. But I just wanted to end the show and talk about someone amazing because... Oh. That's unfortunate.
Yeah. Looks like our internet actually completely dropped out. Okay, well, we were at the end anyway.
Good time.
I guess I'll just type in the chat.